The sky above Valora X had been crying for 3 days straight, and Sergeant Marcus Cole was beginning to think it would never stop. The rain hammered against his helmet like tiny fists, and the wind cut through his uniform no matter how tightly he wrapped himself. He was a human peacekeeper, one of thousands sent by the Galactic Coalition to maintain order after the war that had torn this alien world apart. The fighting had ended weeks ago, but the scars remained everywhere in the broken buildings, the empty streets, and the silence that hung over a city that had once been home to millions. Tonight was his turn to patrol the eastern sector, a maze of ruined palaces and collapsed towers where the Valoran nobility had once lived in splendor. Now it was nothing but rubble and shadows, and Marcus walked through it alone with only his flashlight to push back the darkness. He was about to turn back toward base when a sound cut through the storm, a cry unlike anything he had ever heard before. It was not human, but there was something in it that Marcus recognized instantly. Pure, desperate terror. His feet were moving before his brain could catch up, carrying him through flooded streets and over mountains of debris until he stood before what had once been the grandest palace in the city. The royal residence of the Valoran Emperor himself, now half destroyed by bombs and abandoned by everyone who had once called it home. The cry came again, weaker this time, and Marcus realized it was coming from somewhere below. He found a broken stairway leading down into darkness and descended carefully, his flashlight cutting through the black like a sword. What he found at the bottom made his heart stop. The basement was flooded with freezing black water that had risen to chest height, and in the center of the room stood a creature unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. It was massive, easily the size of a small horse, with golden fur that might have been beautiful if it was not soaked and filthy. 6 powerful legs held its body above the water, but just barely, and its mane flowed around its head like copper fire, even as the flood threatened to swallow it whole. But the worst part was the chain. A thick metal chain connected the creature's jeweled collar to an ornate stone pedestal, pulled so tight that the animal could barely keep its head above the rising water. It had been left here deliberately, trapped and helpless, waiting to drown in the darkness. Marcus waded into the flood without thinking. The cold hit him like a hammer, stealing his breath and making his muscles scream, but he pushed forward anyway. When the creature saw him coming, it let out a warning growl and snapped at him with jaws that could easily crush bone. "Easy there," Marcus said softly, stopping just out of reach. "I know you are scared. I know someone hurt you and left you here to die. But I am not like them, I promise." The creature's 6 eyes studied him with an intelligence that seemed almost human. It was measuring him, trying to decide if he was friend or enemy, and Marcus held perfectly still while it made up its mind. "My name is Marcus," he continued in that same gentle voice. "I am going to get you out of here, but I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the creature's growl faded to a low whimper, and something in its eyes changed. The fight went out of them, replaced by exhaustion and a tiny spark of hope. Marcus moved slowly, keeping his hands where the animal could see them as he approached the chain. The lock was solid Valoran metal, built to last for centuries, but Marcus had a plasma cutter on his belt that could slice through anything. The creature watched him work with those strange copper eyes, and when the chain finally snapped free, it let out a sound that was almost like a sob. Its legs buckled, and it collapsed against Marcus, shivering so hard that he could feel it through his entire body. "I have got you," he whispered, wrapping his arms around the massive creature. "You are safe now." "I have got you." The animal weighed at least 400 pounds, maybe more, but Marcus did not hesitate. He lifted it onto his shoulders and began the long climb back up the stairs, his muscles burning and his lungs screaming for air with every step. When he finally emerged from the flooded basement and into the rain above, 3 members of his squad were waiting with their weapons raised and their mouths hanging open in shock. "Sarge, what in the name of all the stars is that thing?" Private Chun demanded. "It is a Veltari Sundancer," Corporal Yates answered, her voice tight with fear. "They are apex predators from the Valoran Highlands. The nobility kept them as exotic pets, but they had to chain them up and drug them because they are completely untamable. One swipe from those claws can cut through combat armor like paper." "This one was left to drown," Marcus replied, adjusting the weight on his shoulders. "Someone chained it in that basement and walked away. We are taking it back to base." "That is insane," Yates protested. "The moment that thing wakes up properly, it will kill us all." Marcus looked down at the creature on his shoulders, at the wounds where the chains had cut into its flesh, at the way its body shook with cold and exhaustion, at the faint flicker of trust in its eyes when it looked at him. "Then I guess we will find out if you are right," he said firmly, and he began walking toward base without waiting for permission. His squad exchanged worried glances, but followed anyway. They had served with Marcus long enough to know that once he made up his mind about something, nothing in the galaxy could change it. Later, Marcus would learn that the creature had belonged to Princess Viella Sorthin, daughter of the now exiled Valoran Emperor. When the royal family fled ahead of the invasion, she had declared her exotic pet too inconvenient to transport and ordered it left behind. She had chained it in a flooding basement and walked away without looking back, confident that it would simply die quietly and save her the trouble of dealing with it. But Princess Viella had made a mistake. She had assumed that no one would care enough to save a creature that she considered worthless. She had never counted on a human finding it. As Marcus carried the dying Sundancer through the rain towards safety, he made a silent promise. No matter what happened next, he would not abandon this creature the way its owners had. He had heard something crying in the darkness, and he had refused to walk away. That choice would change the galaxy forever, but Marcus did not know that yet. All he knew was that the heartbeat he felt against his back was growing stronger with every step, and that was enough for now. 3 weeks had passed since the night Marcus pulled the dying Sundancer from the flooded basement, and against every prediction, the creature was still alive and still with him. He had hidden it in an abandoned supply depot at the edge of the military base, a crumbling building that nobody used anymore because half the roof had collapsed during the bombing. It was not much, but it was dry and warm and safe from prying eyes. Marcus had named the Sundancer Regal because of the way it held its head even when it was too weak to stand proud and dignified despite everything it had suffered. The name felt right, like it had always been waiting to be spoken. The first week had been a nightmare. Regal was so weak from starvation and infection that Marcus genuinely believed the creature might die at any moment. The wounds from the chains had gone deep, spreading poison through muscles and bone, and Marcus had been forced to steal medical supplies from the base infirmary just to keep the Sundancer breathing. He spent every night after his patrol duties sitting beside Regal, cleaning wounds and applying medicine, and talking in a soft voice about anything and everything. He told the creature about his childhood on a farming colony, about his parents who had died when he was young, about his dreams of one day finding a place where he truly belonged. Regal did not understand the words, but something in that gentle voice seemed to comfort him. By the end of the first week, he had stopped growling when Marcus approached. By the end of the second week, he was eating from Marcus's hand. And by the third week, something magical had happened. Regal began following Marcus everywhere, padding along at his side like a massive golden shadow. At night, when the cold wind blew through the holes in the depot roof, the Sundancer would curl his enormous body around Marcus and keep him warm. And whenever Marcus sat down to rest, Regal would lay his great head in the human's lap and let out a low rumble of contentment. The other soldiers on base had started to notice that something strange was going on. Marcus was always tired, always disappearing after his shifts. and he smelled like wet animal fur no matter how many times he showered. Private Chun was the first one brave enough to follow him. And when he peered through the depot door and saw a massive sundancer lying peacefully at Marcus's feet while the sergeant scratched behind its ears, he nearly fell over from shock. Every xenobiology report in the Coalition database says these things are completely untamable, Chun whispered from the doorway. The Valorans kept them drugged all the time because otherwise they would kill everything in sight. Marcus looked down at Regal, who was making a low rumbling sound in his chest, almost like purring. Maybe nobody ever tried being nice to them. Word spread quickly, and soon a Karathi scientist named Dr. Yamara came to investigate the impossible creature. She was a xenopsychologist with 4 arms, large amber eyes, and an endless curiosity about how different species thought and felt. She spent days observing Regal and Marcus together, taking notes and muttering to herself in amazement. Finally, she sat down with Marcus and shared her theory. I believe sundancers are empathic pack bonders, she explained, her 4 hands moving excitedly as she talked. They are capable of forming deep emotional connections with those who show them genuine care and affection. The reason the Valorans could never tame them is because they never tried to actually bond with them. What do you mean? Marcus asked. The Valorans treated sundancers as status symbols, expensive decorations to show off their wealth and power. Dr. Yamara continued. They kept them chained and drugged because it was easier than earning their trust. But you did something different. You showed Regal that he mattered, that his life had value, and he responded by choosing to trust you. She shook her head in wonder. This changes everything we thought we knew about these creatures. They were never untamable. They simply refused to submit to those who treated them as objects. But not everyone was happy about the discovery. Word had somehow reached the exiled Valoran royal family that Princess Viola's prize sundancer had survived the flooding, and the princess was absolutely furious. She sent message after message to Coalition headquarters, demanding that her property be returned immediately. Coalition diplomats began pressuring Marcus's commanders, explaining that the sundancer was worth more money than most starships, and that keeping it could damage important political relationships. You have to give the animal back, Colonel Torres told Marcus in his office. This is not a request, Sergeant. It is an order. But Marcus refused to bend. Regal is not property. He's a living being who was abandoned and left to die. I am not handing him over to the same people who chained him in a basement and walked away. The argument might have continued for weeks, but then something happened that changed everything. Marcus was walking through the base one evening when a group of insurgents who had been hiding in the ruins launched a surprise attack. Plasma fire erupted from the shadows, and before Marcus could even reach for his weapon, a deadly bolt was flying straight at his heart. He never saw Regal move. One moment the sundancer was 10 meters away. The next, he was between Marcus and the blast, taking the plasma bolt full in his shoulder. Regal roared in pain but did not fall. Instead, he charged at the attackers with a fury that sent them running in terror. By the time base security arrived, the insurgents were gone, and Regal was limping back to Marcus with blood streaming from his wound. Marcus caught the sundancer as he collapsed, cradling that massive head in his arms while tears ran down his face. You stupid, brave animal, he choked. Why did you do that? Regal looked up at him with those 6 copper eyes, and then he did something that no Valoran had ever seen or heard. Sundancer do he pressed his head against Marcus's chest and began to purr. Not the low rumble of contentment from before, but a deep and steady sound that seemed to say everything that words could not. Dr. Yamara watched from nearby, her own eyes glistening with emotion. He loves you, she said softly. In his mind, you are his pack, his family. He would rather die than let anything hurt you. The news of what Regal had done spread across the base and beyond. A supposedly untamable predator had risked its life to save a human soldier, and suddenly all the political pressure to return him to the princess did not seem so important anymore. But Princess Viola was not the type to accept defeat quietly. When she heard that her possession had bonded with a common human soldier, and that the coalition was treating a mere animal's preferences as though they mattered, her cold rage hardened into something dangerous. She demanded a formal tribunal, calling on ancient Valoran property laws and insisting that what belonged to the royal family must be returned. The coalition, caught between human sympathy and alien politics, reluctantly agreed to hear the case. Marcus sat in the medical bay that night, watching Regal sleep peacefully despite the bandages wrapped around his shoulder. Tomorrow they would face the princess and her army of lawyers, and Marcus had no idea how a simple soldier was supposed to win a legal battle against an alien empire. But as he stroked Regal's copper mane, he made a silent promise. No matter what happened in that tribunal, he would find a way to keep his friends safe. They had found each other in the darkness, and nothing in the galaxy was going to tear them apart. The diplomatic cruiser Harmonious Accord was the largest ship Marcus had ever seen, a floating palace of silver and crystal that hung in orbit above Valora X like a second moon. Somewhere inside its gleaming halls, his fate and Regal's would be decided by strangers who had never met them. Marcus stood at the entrance to the Grand Tribunal chamber in his formal military uniform, feeling small and out of place among all the alien dignitaries in their expensive robes and glittering jewelry. But he was not alone. Regal walked beside him without any chains or restraints, moving freely and calmly with his copper mane flowing like fire around his massive head. Every alien in the corridor turned to stare as they passed, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. "Is that really a Sundancer walking loose?" someone whispered. "Impossible," another voice answered. "Those creatures cannot be controlled. It must be drugged." But Regal was not drugged. He was simply choosing to stay at Marcus's side, matching his pace step for step, his 6 copper eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of danger to his human. The tribunal chamber was enormous, with seats rising in tiers on all sides and a raised platform at the far end where the judges sat. But Marcus's attention was fixed on the figure who waited across the room. Princess Viola Sorthen sat on a throne-like chair that made her look down on everyone else. She was beautiful in the cold way that ice sculptures are beautiful, with silver skin and eyes like polished amethysts and an expression that showed nothing but contempt. A dozen Veloran lawyers and advisors flanked her, all clutching data tablets filled with documents and legal arguments. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering every piece of evidence they could find to prove that Regal was property to be reclaimed. "This tribunal will now come to order," announced the chief arbitrator, an ancient Malaxian judge with gray scales and tired eyes. "We are here to determine the rightful custody of the Velthari Sundancer, currently in the possession of Sergeant Marcus Cole." "His name is Regal," Marcus said firmly, and a ripple of surprise went through the chamber. Common soldiers did not usually speak without being addressed first. Princess Viola's lips curved into a thin, cruel smile. "The creature does not have a name. It has a registration number. It is property, not a person, and I have come to reclaim what is rightfully mine." She gestured to her lawyers, who began presenting their evidence, ownership documents signed by the Valoran Emperor himself, breeding certificates tracing Regal's bloodline back 12 generations, purchase records showing that the Sundancer had cost more money than Marcus would earn in 50 lifetimes. "The evidence is clear and irrefutable," the lead lawyer declared triumphantly. "This animal belongs to the royal house of Sorthane. The human has no legal claim to it whatsoever." The arbitrator turned to Marcus. "Sergeant Cole, do you have anything to say in response?" Marcus was not a lawyer. He was not a diplomat. He was just a soldier who had grown up on a farming colony and joined the military, because it was the only way to see the stars. He did not know fancy words or clever arguments, but he knew the truth, and the truth was all he had. 3 days before I found Regal, the princess and her family fled this planet ahead of the invasion. Marcus began, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. They packed up their treasures and their jewelry and their precious belongings, but they left Regal behind. The chamber fell silent as he continued. They chained him in a flooding basement and walked away without looking back. When I found him, the water had risen past his chest. The chains had cut so deep into his flesh that the infection had spread to the bone. He was starving and freezing and so weak he could barely lift his head. Marcus's voice grew stronger. He had been waiting in that darkness for 3 days, hoping that someone would come back for him, and nobody came. Nobody except me. Princess Viola's expression did not change, but her advisors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I carried him out of that basement on my shoulders, Marcus continued. I cleaned his wounds and fed him from my own rations. I sat with him through the fever that nearly killed him and talked to him when he was too scared to sleep. And when he finally got strong enough to stand again, he did not attack me like everyone said he would. He followed me around like a lost child who had finally found someone who cared. Dr. Yamara stepped forward to present her scientific findings, her 4 hands gesturing as she explained what she had discovered. Sundancers are not mindless beasts, she told the tribunal. They are sapient-adjacent beings capable of deep emotional bonds and complex social relationships. The reason Valorans could never tame them is because Valorans never tried to earn their trust. They kept them chained and drugged because it was easier than treating them as living creatures. This is completely irrelevant, Princess Viola interrupted coldly. The animal is property under Valoran law. Its feelings, if it even has any, do not change that legal fact. I had more important concerns during a war than the comfort of a pet. Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. You left him to die. You chained him up knowing that he would drown in that basement. That is not how you treat property you value. That is how you throw away garbage. The princess finally showed a crack in her icy composure, her gem-like eyes flashing with fury. How dare you speak to me that way? I am royalty, and you are nothing but a common soldier from a primitive species. I may be common, Marcus replied calmly, but at least I know the difference between a living being and a piece of furniture. The arbitrator raised a hand for silence before things could escalate further. The tribunal has heard both arguments. However, there is one piece of evidence we have not yet considered: the Sundancer itself. He gestured toward the open floor between Marcus and the princess. Coalition law states that any creature deemed sapient or sapient-adjacent has the right to express preference in matters of custody. We will allow the Sundancer to choose. The crowd murmured with excitement and fear as the handlers cleared a path across the chamber. All eyes turned to Regal, who stood calmly beside Marcus with his copper mane gleaming in the light. For a long, tense moment, the Sundancer did not move. His 6 eyes traveled slowly across the room, looking at the princess on her throne, at the lawyers with their data tablets, at all the alien faces watching him with a mixture of curiosity and terror. Then, without any hesitation, he walked directly to Marcus and sat down beside him, pressing his massive head against the soldier's hip. A gasp of amazement swept through the chamber, but Princess Viola refused to accept the choice. She rose from her throne and strode toward them, her face twisted with outrage. "This is ridiculous," she snarled. "It is just a stupid animal. It does not understand what is happening. Guards, take the creature," and she never finished her sentence. Regal moved like lightning, placing himself between Marcus and the princess. From his throat came a roar that shook the walls of the chamber and made every person in the room stumble backward in primal terror. It was the sound of a creature who had made his choice. and who would die before letting anyone take him from the human who had saved his life. Princess Viella stood frozen, her face pale with shock and humiliation. No one had ever defied her like this, and certainly not an animal she had considered nothing more than an expensive decoration. The arbitrator waited until the echoes of the roar had faded before speaking. The tribunal has reached a decision. Based on the evidence presented and the clear expression of preference by the creature in question, we rule that the Sundancer known as Regal is a sapient bonded companion, not property. He turned to Marcus. Sergeant Cole, you are hereby granted full legal guardianship. Marcus dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around Regal's neck, tears streaming down his face. They had won. They were safe, and nobody could ever separate them again. But as he looked up, he saw Princess Viella watching them from across the chamber. There was no acceptance in her eyes, no graceful acknowledgement of defeat, only cold, burning hatred. You have made a powerful enemy today, human, she said quietly, her words carrying across the silent room. I do not forget, and I do not forgive. Enjoy your victory while it lasts. Then she turned and swept out of the tribunal, and Marcus knew in his heart that their troubles were far from over. 6 months had passed since the tribunal, and Marcus had built a completely new life, far from war and politics and vengeful princesses. He had taken his honorable discharge from the military and moved to New Cascadia, a frontier colony world famous for its endless forests and peaceful communities. He worked as a wilderness ranger now, patrolling the beautiful alien landscapes and helping settlers who got lost among the towering purple trees. It was quiet work, simple work, and after years of fighting and conflict, it suited him perfectly. Their little cabin sat at the edge of a great forest, overlooking a valley filled with flowers that glowed softly when the sun went down. Every evening, Marcus would sit on the porch with Regal beside him and watch the lights bloom across the meadow like earthbound stars. Regal had taken to their new life like he had been born for it. The Sundancer loved the forest, spending hours exploring the strange plants and chasing the small creatures that scurried through the underbrush. But no matter how far he wandered during the day, he always came home before dark. Marcus had never been happier. For the first time in his life, he felt like he truly belonged somewhere. But across the galaxy, Princess Viella had not forgotten her promise. She sat in a hidden space station on the edge of known space, meeting with a group of Kethvari bounty hunters, the most ruthless mercenaries in the galaxy, famous for capturing exotic creatures from every corner of the universe. Their leader was a scarred warrior named Kreth, whose cold black eyes had witnessed more death than most soldiers experienced in 10 lifetimes. Nothing fazed him, nothing scared him, and nothing was beyond his skills if the price was right. I want the Sundancer brought to me alive, the princess commanded, her voice dripping with cold fury. I do not care about the cost, and I do not care about the methods. Kreth studied her with those dead eyes. And the human? Princess Viella's lips curved into a cruel smile that held no warmth. Make sure he has an accident, a permanent one. I want him to suffer before he dies, and I want him to know exactly why. The hunters accepted her payment and went to work, tracking Marcus across the galaxy until they found him on New Cascadia. For weeks they watched him from the shadows, learning his patrol routes and his habits, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Marcus did not know he was being hunted, but Regal could sense that something was wrong. The Sundancer had grown increasingly agitated over the past few days, growling at shadows and refusing to let Marcus out of his sight. His instincts, sharpened by millions of years of evolution, were screaming that danger was approaching. What is bothering you, buddy? Marcus asked as they walked through the forest on their evening patrol. You have been jumpy all week. Regal's answer was a low, continuous growl, his 6 copper eyes scanning the trees with predatory intensity. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight, ready to explode into action at the first sign of threat. Then the hunters struck. A stun net erupted from the bushes without warning, wrapping around Marcus before he could even reach for his weapon. Electromagnetic restraints locked around his arms and legs, and he crashed to the forest floor completely helpless. 6 Kethvari mercenaries emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on Regal. The Sundancer roared and prepared to charge, but they hit him with sedation darts that made his legs wobble and his vision blur. "Easy there, beast," Kreth laughed as he approached the staggering Sundancer. "Those darts have enough sedative to knock out a cargo ship. You will be asleep in 30 seconds. Regal stumbled, but did not fall. Through his drugged haze, he could still see Marcus lying helpless on the ground, and something deep inside him absolutely refused to surrender. "Just an animal," one of the other hunters sneered. "No matter how attached it seems, it is nothing but instinct. Once we take it back to the princess, it will forget about the human within a week." Kreth nodded and holstered his weapon, confident that the creature was no longer a threat. "Load the human into the transport first. The princess wants him alive long enough to watch what we do to his precious pet." That was their fatal mistake. Regal had been playing weak, letting his body sag and his eyes droop while the hunters congratulated themselves on their easy victory. But inside his mind, the fire of loyalty burned brighter than any drug could ever extinguish. He exploded into motion without any warning, moving faster than anyone thought possible for a creature his size. His first swipe sent 2 mercenaries flying before they could even raise their weapons, and his second charge knocked Kreth into a tree with a sickening crack. But this was not the mindless violence of a wild animal. This was tactical, calculated, terrifyingly precise. Regal targeted the hunters closest to Marcus first, always keeping himself between his human and every threat. When one mercenary tried to circle around him, he spun and disarmed the alien with a single swipe. When another raised a plasma rifle, Regal used his own body as a shield, taking the blast across his shoulder rather than letting it reach Marcus. Within seconds, all 6 hunters were down unconscious or groaning in pain, and Regal stood among them like a golden warrior god, bleeding from multiple wounds, but still very much on his feet. Then he did something that no ordinary animal could ever have done. He walked over to Marcus and studied the electromagnetic restraints carefully, turning his massive head to examine them from different angles. And then, with incredible precision, he used the very tip of one claw to press the tiny release mechanism. The restraints clicked open, and Marcus pulled himself free with shaking hands. "Regal," he breathed, staring at his companion with new understanding. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You let them think you were helpless, and then you took them all down." Regal just pressed his massive head against Marcus's chest and purred. When the new Cascadia security forces arrived an hour later, they found Marcus sitting among the unconscious bounty hunters with his Sundancer standing guard. Regal refused to let anyone approach until Marcus personally told him it was safe. The investigation that followed uncovered everything. The hunters' communication logs revealed who had hired them, and Princess Viola's recorded messages left absolutely no doubt about her murderous intentions. "I do not care about the beast anymore," her voice said in one recording, cold and hateful. "I want it killed right in front of him. I want the human to watch and suffer the way he made me suffer when he humiliated me." The evidence was undeniable, and the Galactic Coalition immediately issued a warrant for Princess Viola's arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, illegal use of mercenary forces, and violations of sapient creature protection laws. But the princess had powerful friends and deep pockets, and she vanished before anyone could capture her, fleeing to the outer territories where coalition authority was weak. Marcus knew this was not over. Her hatred had become an obsession, and she would keep coming until one of them was dead. But he also knew something else, something that filled him with fierce pride. Regal was not just a pet or even a companion. He was a partner, a protector, a friend who would stand beside him against any enemy in the galaxy. The creature that everyone had called untamable had chosen to fight for him with intelligence and courage, beyond anything the Valorans had ever imagined. As they sat together on the porch of their cabin that night, watching the flowers glow in the valley below, Marcus made a decision. He was done running and hiding. When Princess Viola came for them again, and she would definitely come, he would be ready. And he would not be facing her alone. 1 year had passed since the attack on New Cascadia, and the galaxy had changed in ways that Princess Viola could never have predicted. The story of Marcus and Regal had spread to 1,000 worlds, inspiring millions and sparking a revolution that threatened everything the Valoran nobility had built. Marcus was no longer just a retired soldier. He had become a symbol of hope, a civilian consultant for the Coalition's newly formed Sapient Creature Rights Division. His testimony and Dr. Yamara's research had led to new laws protecting creatures like Regal across the entire galaxy. Sundancers everywhere were being rescued from chains. Rehabilitation programs based on Marcus's methods were teaching these magnificent creatures to trust again, and one by one, they were finding humans who cared enough to earn their loyalty. But Princess Viola still refused to accept defeat. She had barricaded herself and her family's palace in exile on the frozen moon of Sorthane Prime, surrounded by her last loyal guards and protected by security systems designed to stop entire armies. The Coalition had tracked her there, but every attempt to breach her fortress had failed. Finally, they called Marcus. "We need someone who can navigate the palace defenses," the Coalition commander explained. "Your Sundancer has abilities that could help us get inside. We know this is personal, and we understand if you want to refuse." Marcus looked at Regal, who stood beside him as always loyal, watchful, ready for anything. The Sundancer's copper eyes met his, and Marcus could see the answer there before he even made his decision. "We are not refusing," he said firmly. "She has to answer for what she did, and she needs to see that her cruelty did not break us. It made us stronger." The assault team landed on Sorthane Prime under cover of darkness, fighting through the frozen landscape toward the palace. Regal moved like a ghost through the ice and snow, his golden fur shimmering in the pale starlight. They breached the outer walls and fought through wave after wave of guards, pushing deeper into the fortress with every passing minute. But Princess Viola had one final trap waiting for them. As they entered the main corridor of the inner palace, hidden vents in the walls suddenly opened and began flooding the air with a strange green mist. Marcus did not understand what it was at first. The Regal's reaction told him everything. The Sundancer began coughing violently, his massive body convulsing as the poison entered his lungs. He staggered against the wall, his 6 legs buckling beneath him, and Marcus caught him before he could fall. "It is a neurotoxin," one of the team's scientists reported, her voice tight with horror. "Engineered specifically to target Sundancer physiology. The princess must have been developing this weapon for months." Marcus felt cold rage flooding through his veins. Viola had created a poison designed to kill Regal, and she had filled her entire palace with it just to make him suffer. "Get him to a sealed room," Marcus ordered, lifting Regal onto his shoulders, just as he had done on that first night in the flooded basement. "Find somewhere with filtered air and keep him alive. I am going after her myself." "You cannot face her alone," the team leader protested. "We have no idea what other defenses she has prepared." But Marcus was already moving, his jaw set with determination. "She created this poison to hurt him and punish me. This is personal, and I am the one who has to end it." He found a clean room near the center of the palace with working air filters and laid Regal down gently. The Sundancer's breathing was shallow, his copper eyes clouded with pain, but he was still fighting. Marcus pressed his forehead against Regal's muzzle. "I will come back for you. I always come back. Just hold on a little longer, buddy." Then he sealed the door and continued alone into the heart of the palace. Princess Viella was waiting for him in the throne room, sitting on a chair of carved ice with a ceremonial blade across her lap. She looked older than she had at the tribunal, worn down by a year of running and hiding, but her eyes still burned with the same cold hatred. "You came," she said, rising to her feet. "I knew you would. Your species cannot help itself. You always have to play the hero." "Surrender," Marcus said flatly. "Your guards are beaten, your palace is surrounded, and there is nowhere left to run." But Viella just laughed a bitter, hollow sound that echoed through the frozen chamber. "Surrender. It will never be over. You took everything from me, my pride, my reputation, my future, all because of a stupid animal that should have drowned in that basement." "Regal is not stupid," Marcus replied. "He is smarter and braver and more loyal than you will ever understand. That is why he chose me instead of you." The princess's face twisted with fury, and she launched herself at him with the blade raised. She was trained in ancient Valoran combat arts, centuries of technique refined into deadly precision. Marcus was just a battered soldier who had grown up on a farming colony. By every measure, she should have won easily. But Marcus had something she could never understand. He had spent a year training alongside Regal, learning to move and fight beside a creature who never surrendered no matter how impossible the odds. He had learned patience and timing, and the power of waiting for exactly the right moment. The fight was brutal and ugly, nothing like the elegant duels in old stories. Marcus took cuts to his arms and chest, and his blood stained the icy floor. But he kept moving, kept fighting, kept pushing forward. Finally, he saw his opening. He caught her wrist as she lunged, twisted the blade from her grip, and brought her crashing to the ground with a technique Regal had taught him, using her own momentum against her. Princess Viella lay on the cold floor, beaten and helpless, and Marcus stood over her with the blade in his hand. The temptation to end her was almost overwhelming, but he let the weapon fall instead. "You could have been kind," he said quietly. "It costs nothing to care about a living creature. But you chose cruelty, and it destroyed everything you had." Coalition forces found them there moments later, the princess on the floor, and Marcus already running back to the clean room. Regal was still breathing when he arrived, but barely. His great body trembled, and his eyes were clouded with pain. Marcus dropped to his knees and cradled that massive head in his lap. "Stay with me," he whispered. "The medics are coming. Just stay with me." For one terrible moment, he was not sure if his friend would survive. But then Regal's eyes cleared just slightly, and that familiar purr began rumbling in his chest, weak and unsteady, but refusing to stop. The antidote arrived in time, and within a week Regal was back on his feet. The galaxy celebrated Princess Viella's capture, and Marcus and Regal became more famous than ever before. But they did not want fame, they just wanted to go home. Months later, they sat together on the porch of their cabin on New Cascadia, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of gold and purple. The valley was peaceful, the flowers were glowing, and for the first time in a very long time, no enemies were hunting them. A journalist from the Coalition News Network had traveled all the way there to interview Marcus. She asked all the usual questions about the rescue and the tribunal and the final battle. But her last question was the one that truly mattered. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Why did you risk everything for a creature that nobody else in the galaxy thought was worth saving?" Marcus thought about the question for a long moment, his hand resting on Regal's copper mane as the sun dancer dozed peacefully beside him. "Where I come from, we have a saying," he finally answered. "The measure of a society is how it treats its most vulnerable." The princess looked at Regal and saw possession. I looked at him and saw someone who was scared and alone and desperately needed help. He smiled softly. Humans are not the strongest species in the galaxy, and we are definitely not the smartest. But maybe, just maybe, we are the ones who stop walking when we hear something crying in the dark. Regal lifted his head and looked at Marcus with those 6 copper eyes, then pressed his muzzle against the human's cheek and purred louder than ever before. The journalist wiped her eyes and turned off her recording device. "Thank you," she said softly. "I think the whole galaxy needed to hear that." Marcus nodded and went back to watching the sunset with his friend. Somewhere across the stars, rescued sundancers were learning to trust again, freed from their chains by humans who had heard this story and decided to care. A quiet revolution had begun, changing the way the universe thought about the creatures who shared it. All because one tired soldier had heard something crying in the darkness and had absolutely refused to walk away.